Right. Welcome to Lecture 10, Part 4. This week you have a couple of assignments. You have Unit 11, Document Set 3. You have your Journal 32, which has those 5 readings that are listed there. And then you are going to read the Peace with Honor speech. Notice that we're doing a lot of speeches this unit. The same 3 questions will be used with this speech that you have used the past 2 weeks on the other speeches. Make sure that you're going back and reading the feedback from those assignments so that we can improve our answers moving into the next one. All right, this week we are going to crack into Vietnam. In this lecture, we're going to talk about Vietnam, the history of it, and all the way into Johnson's administration, and then next week we will cover Nixon and his involvement, as well as more on the home front. We'll start the home front this week on Vietnam, and then next week we will finish it. There's a lot of content when it comes to Vietnam, so let's delve right in. So first, where the heck does Vietnam even come from? How do we get involved? What is the goal there? And what we have to look at first is what was going on in Vietnam from the beginning. Under the control of the French, Vietnam had been a colony since the 1800s when the French Empire was large, when colonialism was popular, and the French are going to use Vietnam for the large rice plantations and the mineral wealth that was offered from Vietnam. But under the French, there were laws and high taxes in Vietnam as well as Cambodia and Laos. But by the end of World War II, there are going to be a large number of people, both within these places and outside, that view colonialism as a way of an old life, not a new life. Because of what had happened in World War II, this idea of colonialism and imperialism is going to become incredibly unpopular. By the end of World War II, there are roughly 27 million people in Indochina. Rubber and the large rice plantations, like I said, are going to be controlled by the French. Those are the main sources of wealth from there. And there's going to be really 2 types of people: those that benefit from the wealth and those that were impoverished by the control of the French. And of course, those who benefit from these large industries are going to support the French rule, and those who are going to be pushed further into poverty because of those high taxes are going to want to rebel against that French rule. Ho Chi Minh is going to lead a movement demanding the independence from the French in the 1890s. Ho Chi Minh is going to become the face throughout the Vietnam War of the pushback against not only French control, but U.S. dominance, and a push for the installation of a communist leadership in Vietnam. Truman is going to struggle when it comes to Vietnam. Who do we support? Who do we not support? He does not support the idea of colonialism or these old European powers, but he also doesn't want to see someone like Ho Chi Minh become successful and instill a communist regime in Vietnam. So he's going to support the French leadership over Ho Chi Minh, and that's kind of where this all tumbles downhill. What we see over time as this need to stop Ho Chi Minh, to stop the spread of communism, increase, especially after China falls to communism in 1949. Between 1950 and 1954, the United States is going to give $2.6 billion to the French war effort. Under Eisenhower, this is only going to continue. Money is going to be continuously sent to the French to fight against the Viet Minh in the name of this idea of the domino theory. the domino theory stated that if Vietnam were to fall to communism, then we could see Japan, we could see the Philippines, we could see Australia, we could see Laos, we could see Cambodia all fall to communism. And that was really the ultimate fear here. In 1954, the French are going to surrender their fight in Vietnam after the Viet Minh take a French military base in Vietnam. And what we're going to see happen is kind of the Korea strategy be implemented. The Geneva Accords are going to divide Vietnam at the 17th parallel into two countries. You have North Vietnam and South Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh is going to rule in North Vietnam, while the United States is going to prop up an anti-communist government in the South. These Geneva Accords are going to call for free elections in 1956 that would hopefully, by that time, unite Vietnam under one leadership. Now, when we agree, not us, but us, agree to the Geneva Accords, the idea was that these free elections would decide whoever the people wanted as their leader. Whether that meant that that leader was communist or not, these free elections were supposed to unite Vietnam under one leadership in 1956. So in that about 2-year time span, Vietnam was supposed to be organized enough to elect their own leader. Maybe we're getting some deja vu feelings. We've been trying to also do this in the Middle East for some time. Prop it up, organize, get them to elect their own leaders so that we can squeak out. But as with Vietnam, this precedent gets set, and we're going to see, so I won't get too far ahead of myself, that we don't really leave. In the Vietnam, we are going to see the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization be formed. This is known as SEATO. It's formed in 1954, and the goal is to contain the threat of communism in Southeast Asia. Eisenhower is going to put together an alliance like SEATO to contain the communist aggression that we had been seeing in the free territories of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, which is deemed the Southeast Asia in general. Now, the Secretary of State under Eisenhower, we know him very well, John Foster Dulles, is going to put this military alliance together, and it's going to include a large number of different countries. We have France, Great Britain, Australia, New Zealand, the Philippines, Pakistan, Thailand, the United States, all pledging themselves to act to meet the common danger in the chance that there is aggression in any of these places or anywhere they deem that needs help. They're going to designate Laos, Cambodia, and the Free Territory under the jurisdiction of the state of Vietnam, which is a really long way of saying South Vietnam, as the subject of the provisions of this treaty. So any of those countries that I named, that long list, if they see fit, can intervene in South Vietnam, South Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, to stop the spread of communism. We're really kind of mirroring something that we've already done before. SEATO should remind you of NATO. It's the same idea, mutual defense, that if one participates, they all participate. And it's supposed to help stop the spread of communism, but it sounds like we're getting into another entangling alliance that could push us into a place where we would get into a little bit of trouble. The language of the treaty doesn't go so far as to designate absolute mutual defense, so it doesn't explicitly write out that anybody has to fight, but it's supposed to be this kind of handshake understanding that they would. The lack of actually putting that in the agreement is going to significantly weaken SEATO as a military alliance. But SEATO is what we use as a legal basis for U.S. involvement in South Vietnam. SEATO expires in June of 1977. So SEATO is incredibly important because that's like our door open into Vietnam, saying, well, we have to protect Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. This is how we do it. Now, the United States in South Vietnam is going to prop up an anti-communist leader. This anti-communist leader is Diem. We are going to send economic and military aid in the very beginning to support Diem, a nationalist and anti-communist. But he is not very popular. America's going to support him anyway, just based on his beliefs. So in 1954, he is going to request to serve as the Prime Minister of the Republic of Vietnam, which is South Vietnam. He is going to refuse to carry out the 1954 Geneva Accords, which had called for free elections throughout Vietnam in 1956, because he wanted to establish his own dominance in southern Vietnam, and he realized that in a free election that would be taken away. He was not going to be reelected. He didn't have the numbers to do so. South Vietnam is going to be torn apart by dissident groups and political factions. And this kind of paves the way for Diem to establish an autocratic regime that where he puts his own family in some of the highest ranking positions there. Diem is going to be able to resettle hundreds of thousands of refugees from North Vietnam into the South with the support of the U.S. military and economic aid. But there's a caveat there. His own Catholicism and the preference he showed to the Roman Catholics is going to drive these resettlements. And it's also going to push for him to be unaccepted by the Buddhists, who were the overwhelming majority in South Vietnam. Diem never fulfills his promises of land reforms, and during his rule, communist influence and the appeal among the Southerners for the communist-inspired National Liberation Front, also known as the Viet Cong, which we'll talk about more, increased these intense movements, attacks against his government. Now, Diem is going to respond with his own military attacks against the insurgency. He is going to be seen as very heavy-handed and ineffective, only deepening his own unpopularity and isolating him from the people. Eventually, Diem is going to be imprisoned. Eventually, Diem is going to end up imprisoning and killing those who expressed opposition. So I don't know what this sounds like to you, but when you see a leader backed by the United States who is supposed to be against communism, favoring one minority against the majority, not carrying out any effective policies, imprisoning those who go against his leadership, this doesn't sound like a government that we should be supporting. We are going to see during this time matters within the Buddhist community, that majority, come to a head in 1963 after the government forces several people at a May rally at gunpoint to move away, and several people will be killed. You're going to start to see these large Buddhist protest rallies come about, especially in Saigon, and we'll talk about that more this week in class. Eventually, the protests and the just absolute terrible treatment of the Buddhists are going to persuade the United States to withdraw our support from Diem, and his generals will assassinate him in a coup. So really what we see happening with this U.S. Support of Diem is that our name gets tarnished in Vietnam. Not only do we see in 1957 the National Liberation Front be formed, which eventually becomes known as the Viet Cong, Vietnamese for communism, but everybody who looks at the United States says they're only here for their best interest. They're not here to help the people or listen to what the people want. They're here to stop the spread of communism, which we kind of shoot ourselves in our own foot for that, because in supporting Diem, we make the appeal to another leader, even a communist leader, look better, because we supported someone who was supposed to be anti-communist and ends up being worse than maybe some of the communist leaders that people see in the movement. Now, with JFK in Vietnam, we are going to see some pieces change here. In a public exchange of letters with South Vietnamese President Diem, JFK is going to formally announce that the United States will increase aid in South Vietnam. So JFK is going to agree to that military intervention, that economic aid that was propping up Diem, allowing him to commit these terrible acts against the people and to become a really corrupt leader. People are not going to agree with this because the increased aid and the expansion of U.S. troops commitment sounds like we are going to war. Kennedy's chief military advisor, Taylor, and special assistant for National Security Affairs, Rostow, are going to return from a fact-finding trip to Saigon, and they will urge the president to increase the military advisory support to Diem and the economic aid, saying that there needed to be extensive, intense training of the local self-defense troops by American military advisors. So what they're saying is the military that is on the ground in Vietnam is not going to be successful unless we train them to be successful. So what they say is, in order for us to get out of Vietnam, we have to increase our supports in Vietnam to later on down the road pull out. I don't know about you, but this sounds a lot like Afghanistan. Just saying. So what we're going to see happen is the deployment of 8,000 American combat troops that will be used to support the South Vietnamese forces in combat operations against the insurgents, the Viet Cong, that National Liberation Front that I talked to you about on the last slide. This does not go over well. There is going to be resistance to these foreign troops, which Diem saw as a potential Viet Cong propaganda campaign. So what Taylor and Rostow suggest is that forces be called flood control team instead of military reinforcements. So it's a branding campaign that we're going with here. Kennedy is going to accept these recommendations, and the United States is not going to commit combat troops, but we will send the support to help put down any of the resistance to Diem. And again, this is sounding a little hypocritical of the United States to continue to be propping up a guy who is not that great. We are going to see, like I said, Diem be murdered in a coup by his own generals in November 1963. Very shortly after that, Kennedy is going to be assassinated. At the time of Kennedy's death, there were more than 16,000 U.S. advisors in that flood control team in South Vietnam. LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson, Kennedy's successor, is going to rapidly escalate the war, which is going to result in the commitment of U.S. ground forces and eventually increase that number to 500,000 American troops in Vietnam. Johnson is going to say that all communists are the same kind of communists. There is no difference between the Soviet Union, China, or Vietnam. Johnson will announce that aggression by terror against peaceful villages in South Vietnam will now be joined by open aggression on the high seas against the United States. So what he's saying is any aggression is going to be met with aggression by the U.S. And this leads us to the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution is going to be passed after the USS Maddox was fired upon by northern Vietnamese forces. Johnson is going to order an airstrike against northern Vietnam for attacking one of our ships and ask Congress for American troops. Now, when he asks for this assistance, when we see that our ships are now becoming an open target in Vietnam, the powers of the president are going to be expanded. Think about the Spanish-American War after the USS Maine was attacked and that picture that was painted in the press. The same thing is going to happen within the Gulf of Tonkin with the USS Maddox. After that, some people, not all people, are going to see that there is an aggressive stance of the people in Vietnam against the United States. And even though we put ourselves there, we have now been attacked and we need to attack back. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution says that the president can take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States to prevent further aggression. Essentially, this gave Johnson tremendous war powers and allowed him to commit U.S. troops to southern Vietnam and fight a war against northern Vietnam and any southern Vietnam people who were against the government the United States was propping up, without going back to Congress to ask for a declaration of war. And this is how we don't officially declare war, but we fight a war somewhere. What this does is really expand the powers of the president. When they say take all necessary measures to repel an armed attack, they are essentially giving the president a get out of jail free card, an open ticket to do whatever they want in Vietnam. And that's going to lead us to February of 1965 when Johnson starts Operation Rolling Thunder. This is going to be a response to a Viet Cong attack that killed American troops. And what this looks like is Johnson continuously ordering bombing of the Viet Cong to hopefully force the communists to negotiate peace. But this is not going to be great. Instead, it's going to create a larger problem. We are going to see some point out the larger problem that is developed here. We have Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, advising Johnson that increasing the military presence would win the war, but eventually Robert McNamara is going to come out in and we'll talk about these, the Pentagon Papers saying that that increased effort only led to our downfall, not our win. Troops are going to be assigned to guard bases, conduct searches, destroy missions to kill as many Viet Cong as they could. Helicopters are going to use quick airstrikes against the enemy positions. The Viet Cong are going to take the stance that they could wear the American troops down by attacking at night, setting traps, using explosives on unexpected U.S. bases. Their plan was that they would avoid losing the war and the U.S. would eventually leave. So our increased presence in Vietnam leads the Viet Cong to attack our troops in different ways, in new ways. The fighting of the Viet Cong is going to be something that really changes the layout of war. These attacks at night, these traps being set, the not wearing a uniform and just kind of being these rogue fighters changes what war looks like again. And we've seen this progression of war from the Spanish-American War to World War I, to World War II, to the Korean War, and now Vietnam. The enemy looks significantly different in each of those different positions of combat. The war was supposed to build a stable government that was not communist in South Vietnam, but due to the corruption in the government that had little support from the people, we really put ourselves in a place where we're having a really hard time gaining the support of the people in South Vietnam. The United States gets to be seen as kind of the enemy, really. American forces are going to win some large battles, but we couldn't really achieve success. Like I said, the fighting of the Viet Cong, the knowledge of their land, these small battles, these guerrilla warfare tactics are going to get them to be closer to a victory. Many of the battles are going to be fought at night, which reduce the effectiveness of all of our technology, which really should have put the United States at a place to win this war, but it puts us at a place to lose because we can't effectively use the technology that we have. By 1968, like I said, there are going to be over 500,000 troops in Vietnam. 30,000 had died. Soldiers are fighting for a variety of reasons, meaning that it's really hard to pinpoint why we are there and what we are doing. Some of the reasons are going to be people are there to protect the villagers because this war is going to take place anywhere and everywhere. There is no designated war field. So some are going to say we need to be here to protect the people that are being affected by the fighting that have no want to be involved. Some are going to fight for their country. They're going to fight for the name of the United States, and that is enough. They just have pride in the United States. The United States tells them to be there, so they will be there. And others are going to feel that it's their duty. It is their duty to protect democracy. It is their duty to stop the spread of communism. But because there were so many different reasons to fighting, and the many light losses and heavy loss that we see, morale is going to start to decline when soldiers start to see that they're fighting a war for those who were not willing to die to defend themselves. And this really changes the landscape of the war. What else really starts to shake the effectiveness of the war are the other new technologies beyond the terrible, dangerous technologies we saw in World War II that are going to be used. And we'll talk more about Agent Orange in class this week, but Agent Orange has cancer-causing agents and other physical problems that we see coming out here. It will be an herbicide that was meant to kill plant life because we thought if we could destroy the land, then maybe they wouldn't be able to farm. That would destroy their economy, maybe bring them to the table. There is also going to be the use of napalm, which is a jellied gasoline. It's that second picture down at the bottom there, that when it is dropped, it covers large areas in flames. But this is very difficult to put out, and it would cling to anything that it touched. And these planes, they don't know if there's people there when they're dropping Agent Orange or when they're dropping napalm. They are just dropping it. And that changes what this war looks like as well. Let's begin our discussion on the people on Vietnam in the United States. America is going to be incredibly divided over this war. The number I keep coming back to, in 1967, 500,000 American troops being put in Vietnam, the casualty count increasing, the number of wounded over 100,000. As people see this war stretching on, soldiers are going to come to mistrust the government's reason for keeping them there. And Washington is just going to keep on repeat this claim that we'll win the war, we'll win the war. That idea in the later years of the war is going to increase physical and psychological deterioration of American soldiers, both volunteers and draftees. And what we see from these people, because of the mixed message of the war and how terrible the fighting was, we'll see drug use, PTSD, mutinies within these troops that are stationed there. Between July of 1966 and December of 1937, we see about 503,000 U.S. military personnel desert. And what this leads to is a pretty large anti-war movement among American forces. We're going to see violent protests, killings, mass incarceration of personnel in Vietnam, as well as within the United States. This bombardment of horrific images of the war on televisions, because people are going to watch this from their living room, will turn the American home front against the war. In 1967, 35,000 demonstrations staged a massive Vietnam War protest outside the Pentagon. We see 35,000 demonstrators. Opponents to the war are going to argue that civilians, not the enemy combats, were the primary victims, and that the United States was supporting a corrupt dictatorship in Saigon, which we were. Uh, so what we see form in the United States are two separate groups. We have the Hawks, supported by Johnson and his war efforts to stop the spread of communists, increase the level of troops and spending. Hawks are for the war, support the war. Doves, on the other side, peace, no war. Think of a delicate dove. Did not support Johnson's war effort. This is going to include liberal politicians, pacifists, student radicals, civil rights leaders. The war in Vietnam was meant to be a quick victory against a country that was not technologically advanced, but what it ends up doing, Johnson has to raise the taxes because the government spending on the war increases and they need more money. The war was seen as a civil war instead of a Cold War conflict, which also pins people against the war. The Selective Service Act of 1948 that was passed had allowed for 1.5 million men to be drafted in Vietnam. Draftees who had registered at 18 are now going to be called up for military needs on the basis of the lottery system. A lottery drawing was held in 1969 at Selective Service National Headquarters in Washington, D.C. This event was going to determine the order of call for induction during the calendar year of 1970. So just an example of how we're doing this draft. So when this lottery drawing was held, the people that they're calling from were born between January 1st, 1944 and December 31st, 1950, which would make them over 18 years old. The lottery was a change from the draft the oldest man first method, which had been used in deciding the order of the call. How they did this, first of all, it was televised, it was on the radio, it was filmed. They would have this big, huge container with blue plastic capsules inside containing birth dates, and they would draw out the capsules by hand and call out the number of the men within the 18 to 26 age range that would be called to service. These capsules are going to really determine who has to serve and who doesn't serve. Under this system, though, with the Selective Service Act, there are deferments. So even if you got called in that random lottery system that was supposed to present a better picture of how people were being drafted, you could defer, meaning not go in, if you were in college or if you worked in certain occupations that were deemed necessary. Many of the men that were sent to war end up being from the working class and poor backgrounds because they could not afford to be in college or they didn't work in these high class industries. And that is what spurs the anti-war protests such as Stop the Draft Week in October of 1967, where you will see the burning of draft cards. This lottery system, while it wasn't supposed to be controversial, ends up being controversial because of the deferments. We are going to see a new social class come out. The new social class is going to be the college student. Campuses are going to be one of the most remembered aspects of the Vietnam War. College students were not the only ones to protest, but student activism is going to play a key role in bringing anti-war ideas to the broader public. Now let's go back a little bit. The baby boom generation came of age during the Cold War in this really affluent, nice, doing well economy in the United States. When they entered college in the early 1960s, some of the young people are going to be influenced by reading the works of radical critics in post-war America. These intellectuals are going to question the Cold War foreign policy of the communists and containment and these ideas that the United States has to be involved. And they're going to really consider these ideas and then apply them to the Vietnam War. Johnson, when he escalates the Vietnam War in 1965, gave way to the Student for a Democratic Society to really push a cause of its own and really begin to recruit many different members to their group. The Students for a Democratic Society are going to be exactly what they call themselves. They are students from college campuses that are for a democratic society, coming about in 1960, but really increasing their membership in 1965. They are going to oppose the war because they felt it was unjust and they feared being drafted. As the war continues to escalate, so did the militancy of these anti war students. College campuses are going to become the center of these anti war protests for several reasons. First, the United States had recently welcomed the largest birth cohort in American history, the baby boomers, which were 76 million people born during the baby boom, 1946 to 1964. College enrollment is going to swell, and 3 million in 1960 to 10 million in 1970. That is 7 million more people going to college. The number of faculty is going to have to increase in that time. Most of the students and faculty are going to be anti war activists. Another reason, enrollment growth. Many colleges are going to engage in military related research and allow for recruiters from corporations with the military contracts to come to campus in search of new employees. So the students that are against the war are getting inside information on what the war effort was doing. Another reason that these college campuses become the epicenter of anti-war protests is the size. The Department of Defense could afford to give draft deferments to millions of male students because of how many were in the baby boom. Uh, not everybody had to mobilize for the war. And because just 17% of college students came from working and lower to middle class families, it was no surprise that 80% of the people who are going to be drafted to serve in the military came from those blue collar background. Although students could avoid the Vietnam War by staying in college until they were too old to be drafted, they were always in danger that they could flunk out and then be drafted. And the fear of the draft is going to really push these anti war protests. By 1968, the Students for a Democratic Society had grown their membership to 100,000 members. They're mostly going to come from middle to upper class families. They grew up in that post World War II society, especially in the suburbs, that nuclear family that we talked about. That's these kids coming into adulthood where they really didn't see a lot of working class whites or racial minorities. Some are going to have pretty elite backgrounds. These students are going to be the new social class, the new citizen that were being challenged to think critically and were really free of adult responsibilities. They're going to be in that in between time where they're not paying taxes and being faced with adult decisions, but they're also not going to be children under their parents' roofs. And college, in and of itself, always asks you to think critically. And this is what pushes us to have those anti-war efforts on the college campuses. The free speech movement in Berkeley, California is going to encourage other students to challenge authority just like the Students for a Democratic Society do. And one of the tools that they used was their teach-ins, very similar to a sit-in where they would have people come learn about the war effort and what was happening. When we look at families on the war, like I said, this is going to be the first real living room war because a large amount of Americans are going to have a television in their home, meaning they could watch everything that was happening in the war. They could see troops and the conditions that they were in, having to fight against what they were seeing, the terrain that they were fighting on, and these reports are going to be brought to them by major broadcasting agencies. This will only lead to the hawk and dove parties to grow, and that drifts them further and further apart. As there's no victory in sight, people are only going to grow more polarizing in their views. There is going to be what's called a credibility gap form. The government is going to continue to push this we are going to win attitude and these optimistic statements. But what the people are seeing on the TV doesn't match with what the government is telling them. So the people are going to begin to distrust the statements made by the government and trust their own eyes instead. And that increases this fight at home of people who want to get out of the war, who don't want to send their sons to war, who don't want their taxes increased anymore. They just want the war to end. But the government is going to be on the other side of that and say we have to increase efforts in order to get out. We have to fight harder in order for this to end. And this credibility gap forms between the people and their government. Now, we are going to go more in depth in this on this when we get into class this week, but I want to give you some overview of the counterculture movement. The generation gap is also going to form. Remember, I'm telling you, the baby boomers, just the baby boomers. There are so many of them in this generation that are going to change so quickly in their behaviors and their values that there is this gap between the older generation and the younger generation coming into adulthood. Think about it. When your parents hear the music on the radio or your grandparents hear the music on the radio, they're like, what are you listening to? What is this garbage? A lot of that is going to be heading around. We are going to see the new left develop, which is left-wing politics that had attracted primarily middle-class college students. And this new left is going to be a push to be more liberal, more progressive than even the left that already existed. Because you got to think, LBJ is a Democrat. He's technically on the left, but they are going to see what the government is doing and push even further from that. Hippies are going to form during this time, mostly middle-class whites without the political drive. They're going to have that signature style of jeans, tie-dye shirts, sandals, beards, long hair, a life that embraced sexual promiscuity and recreational drugs, including marijuana and LSD, that is listening to the new rock music of the Grateful Dead, Jimmy Morrison, Janis Joplin, along with these ideas of communes in the countryside. Hippies are going to be a whole new class of people. Woodstock is going to happen at this time. The Woodstock Festival, held in upstate New York in August of 1969. It was called 3 Days of Peace, Music, and Love. The promoters expected a large crowd, but not the 300,000 to 400,000 people who actually attended. You are going to see art change at this time. You're going to see music change at this time. And the common theme here is a reject for tradition. We are pushing forward in religion, in music, in societal roles, and that's really where we're going to push into this week. We're going to see an embracement of Eastern religions becoming popular, which just had those wasps shaking in their boots. And that's where we'll pick up this week in class, because there is so much more that we have to delve into with this counterculture movement. Don't forget about your Journal 32 and your readings, your Unit 11 Document Set 3, and your Peace with Honor speech evaluation. Any questions on anything, you let me know.